Hey guys, and welcome to my first official YouTube tutorial. I am excited to share with you guys a little bit of the process and how I approach sculpting in general, but also obviously specifically we're going to be working on this really cute dinosaur. And I will include this reference image in the description box below. It is not, I do not own this image. I found it on Pinterest and it is by a wonderful artist by the name of Holly Mengert. Alrighty, so without further ado, let's just dive right into it. So as you can see, I'm starting out with a sphere, and this one is going to represent the skull of my character. I will duplicate and shrink that sphere and place it roughly where the snout would go. And again, that would just be like the placeholder for my snout. And basically my approach here is just to block out my character in the most basic form as possible. So for the neck, I'm using the tube tool in Nomad, which is a very useful. It's just a little, it's a tube, and you can use the curve to just draw out the shape you need. And I love this tool. You'll probably see me using it a whole lot. Because you can just have so much control of the curve. Like you see here, I can control the radius of each point separately. I can also just move each of those points to where I need them to be from all the angles. And it just has a lot of other settings that are really useful. So this is a really awesome tool to play with. But again, a lot of adjustment, and the point here is not to be perfect, but to get an idea, a general idea of your placement and each of the objects' relationship to each other. And that's just going to set you up for success when you get further along in the process. Okay, and then here I am just adding another sphere for my torso and roughly placing it where I think it should go, bringing it up to the size I feel would be the most accurate. And again, this is all very rough. Like, none of this is, your final product or anything like that. You definitely have to trust the process when it comes to sculpting, because it's gonna look funky before it's gonna look cool. Just keep that in mind. And then I am also using my reference image as a rough, measure to make sure that my proportions are at least somewhat correct. And you also have to keep in mind the fact that our sculpt right now is in orthographic mode, so we're not sculpting in perspective, and our picture also is in a perspective, right? We're not looking at the character straight on forward, so we're not necessarily going to be, getting the full 360 idea of what our character is doing on the other side, or what it looks like back there. And some of our proportions are going to be distorted because he is at an angle, but that's okay. This is why we're blocking things out in this way. We're blocking it out straight on, and that way we can just kind of pose and adjust later on. But again, here I go. I'm using this tube tool, the same one that we did for the neck, and I'm just drawing a rough little noodle arm on the side of my character, and roughly trying to get that placement of where I think it should go according to our reference image. So one of the settings we have up here for our tube tool is the mirror tool, and I'm going to turn that on to show you guys what it looks like. And so it's really handy so that you don't have to, sculpt something twice. But in this case, I decided to do the hands separately, and I might change my mind. I don't remember if I changed my mind with this, but I wanted to be able to control the arms separately, and if I mirror them, it's going to do exactly that. It's going to mirror my arms. And obviously, as we see this little guy in the reference image, his arms are not mirrored. One of them is higher, the other one is lower. They're behaving separately, as arms do in the real world. So I want to kind of break that symmetry and start to pose them accordingly, and that's why I chose to not use the mirror tool in this case. But of course, there are times where you do want to use the mirror tool to just make your life easier. Okay, and then once I'm happy with the placement roughly of the arms, I'm going to move to the legs, and same thing, using that tube tool, drawing out my shape, and then playing with the scale, with the radius of each of our nodes, our little points on our curve, to draw our leg. Then I'm going to draw the other one on the other side. And one thing I wish, and maybe there is a setting and I'm just not aware, but I wish that it would keep the same scale of the shape you just drew previously, so that in this case you'll see me kind of eyeball the radius of each of the legs to try and match them. But obviously that's not the best way to do this. And then you can add more points here, which is also really cool. Once you've already drawn your shape, you can add more points. So here I'm doing that to get the little knee bend of the leg. And I think here's where I decide this is not going to work. So I delete I guess I deleted both. I delete the left leg, and I decide to use the mirror tool. No, that's a lie. I decided to clone them. So again, there's so many different approaches. I could have mirrored the legs, and then I could have validated them, which I'll go more into that later on. I'm sure that I use that I guess method of duplicating. But in this case, I just cloned it and moved it to the other side. So at least I know the legs will be the same thickness all throughout. And then I could still work on them separately, so they're not actually mirrored. And yeah, I can still move them. They both still have their nodes because I have not validated them. So that's another way to approach this to keep in mind. I could have done that for the arms too. Now that I think about it, I kind of just eyeballed that thickness of the arms. I didn't really consider whether they matched or not. Now they look fine, but if you want to be more accurate, that's another way to do it. And then here I am just kind of grabbing all of my items and moving them above the grid line, so that once I make the feet, I can kind of make sure they're both flat on the ground and, in that same line. And in this case, the legs, I can also see that one is kind of coming down lower than the other, so I can adjust that. So it's always good to check your grid and check your model from different angles, of course. And then moving on to just continue to adjust each of my forms. So this is our little tail, which we also did with the tube tool, and just adjusting the radius of each of those nodes to get that taper. I'm also going to start to adjust our body, and so make it wide, scaling that sphere so it's not perfectly round, but it's wider on the sides to kind of give the effect of the hips. And same thing with the torso, just kind of adjusting that to make sure it is making sense and it's matching our reference. And again, looking at it from all the different angles, make sure that it's, at least roughly looking similar to what our goal is, our end product. Okay, and then I'm going to start to block out my little boxes, the boxes he's holding, because that's just going to help me also visualize the correct placement of our character's arms, and even just how wide I should make the torso, and so on and so forth. And I'm just doing this by really just using a primitive cube shape that's default in Nomad, and then I'm just scaling it to try and match what I already do have for his arms placement. And one thing to keep in mind is you want to think about the symmetry, or I guess lack thereof, the asymmetry, and you don't want to make everything symmetrical, right? It's, our eyes are not going to like that very much, and it's good to have balance, but you have to also think about how to make the composition interesting. And that's one reason I like to work from reference a lot, because I guess I don't have to think that much about it. If I was trying to come up with my own personal concept, then of course these were things that I want to think about. But ultimately, even when choosing a reference image, you want to make sure that this artist did in fact keep a lot of these things in mind, and it, the lack of symmetry. And that's one reason I really do love these little characters. It did just have so much personality. I love that, he's just kind of in motion. Even the boxes lack symmetry, and there's a story being told. So these are just little things to think about. And then here, I'm using a cylinder to build his little foot. And again, as you can see, during this process, I'm breaking up these shapes or these forms into different shapes as simple as possible, because it's just, again, going to make your life easier. At the end, I can merge everything and you'll see that, of course, but right now we just really want to block every part of our character out, and it's just going to allow us for more freedom when you want to pose them, when you want to move stuff around. Okay, and so I'm going to hide my foot and my boxes because they're just going to be distracting. I am ready to move on to something else. And that's another tip, is just to not spend too much time on one specific area, especially at the beginning and when you're in this blocking stage. So I oftentimes just kind of, dance around my model and work on different areas, even if I'm not done with one. And that's just kind of the point, to adjust constantly and tweak until you get, the best results possible. And so again, here I'm going back and I'm moving on my torso forward. I'm noticing how in the image his back is arched. I don't know. English is not my first language. But it's curved, right? It's not just straight. So I make sure I move that sphere forward a little bit. Now I'm thinking about the feet again. I'm just kind of looking at my reference image and seeing how this foot could go forward a little more. And also thinking about how the legs and the, pants intersect, like where that thigh would come out of. And once I merge this, what that would look like and what would be the best positioning for that upper leg. So again, these are the things you want to think about as you're adjusting. And besides your scaling up and down and your moving and tweaking and rotating, one of the things you most definitely should do is use the move brush in Nomad to really push and pull those shapes to your advantage and really get them to that finished product. So, once I'm happy with the positioning of them, I will start to use that move tool to really get the shape of his little butt, of his body, and kind of wrap some of that around the legs and give it that, more realistic shape. The body's not necessarily a sphere. That's the closest shape maybe to it from the picture, but it definitely has a lot of different curves, flat areas. It's wider in certain areas, it sticks out in others. So just, again, something to keep in mind. Okay, and then the next step for me is to start to pose the character a little bit more closer to our reference image. So once again, I'm happy with the block out and, some of those shapes, I'm starting to move that neck to match the angle of the picture. And his head is a little bit kind of leaning towards the right and looking over those boxes. And of course, his body's shifted in that way as well because he is walking. So those are, again, you want to kind of consider that and look closely at the reference, and also just think about how your body would move if you were in that same scenario. And sometimes, so you'll see me kind of regret this decision a little bit later on, because once I start to sculpt on the face, my symmetry will be a little off. So for example, I'm going to be adding the eyes, the spheres for eyes and little eyebrows, and those will no longer be symmetrical to our head because our head is no longer sitting on the world axis since I've moved it. So I'm going to have to manually try and match those up to the face and where they would be, like eyeballing them. Okay, so now that I'm happy with my positioning and my pose, I'm going to start to sculpt on some of the areas. So his little eyebrows will be first, or I guess his eye sockets rather. And here, as you can see, I'm making sure that my symmetry is set to local symmetry, so it uses the symmetry of the actual sphere rather than the world, because again, I moved the sphere, so it's no longer using the world axis. And then in this case, I'm using the clay tool in subtract mode so that it carves instead of adds. And I'm just kind of roughly, again, I'm just eyeballing where I think these eyes would go and where I want the spheres to just kind of sit nicely in, but also leaving that nice little brow structure to like kind of hug them and give our little dinosaur some more structure on his face. And then repeating the same exact thing but on the little snout to create the nostril. Just kind of carving those out. And I also, go in with the smooth tool to soften out those edges. And again, just looking at it from all the different angles to make sure it looks good. Of course, our snout and our head aren't merged yet, and so it's going to look a little rough, but once it is merged and that rough line isn't there, stuff is going to start to look a lot more like it makes sense. Okay, so now here I'm going to add the eyeballs, and here's where you'll see me have an issue when I try to use the mirror tool, because of course they're going to mirror each other, but they're going to mirror each other on that world center axis, which again our head is no longer sitting on, and so it's going to be quite literally an eyeball. I'm going to quite literally have to just eyeball the positioning, which isn't too bad in this case because I already have my eye sockets, so I know the placement, they just have to fit into that eye socket. Okay, and then for our little eyebrows, I'm actually going to use a sphere, and I'm going to just validate it, which all that means is it's going to allow me to use my sculpting tools on it. It's no longer going to be, just a sphere, but now I can mess with the actual topology of it. And I like to just squish it down into almost like the shape of a bean, I guess. And here I'm kind of adjusting the head as well to make sure it makes more sense. It looks more like a skull. But the little bean eyebrow, once again, I'm going to grab it and use both my gizmo to, rotate it and have it sit directly on that eyebrow line. And then here's where I'm going to use my move tool to kind of, again, pull it and push it into the shape I want. And just make sure it, looks like a little eyebrow, kind of matching the ones that are in the reference image again. And you could do this a couple of different ways. You don't have to use a sphere, but I feel like a sphere gives me a more of the stylized eyebrow, like a more chunky, rounded one. I could also use the tube tool, which I do a lot for my, I guess, more humanoid characters, and you can do a really nice brow with that as well. but this is just what I feel made the most sense, as he does have really small, teeny, little round brows. And again, just a lot of adjusting, trying to match the picture. In the picture, they're kind of floating up top of his head. They're not really sitting on it. So I'm trying to see how I could approach that in this 3D format. And then here I am again, mirroring those eyebrows, and gonna have a similar issue with the eyeballs. In this case, I'm just gonna have to, once again, manually move them to match. Okay, and now I'm going to work on the little, I guess I'm gonna call it, it's the eyelash, yeah, the eyelashes, the little black line around the eyes, which honestly, I'm not too sure if that's in the reference image. I can't really tell. I think it is, but this is also one of my favorite things to do. Now, I'm not gonna give him actual little, I guess, wings coming out of the eyelash. It's really just gonna be a border around the eye. And again, I used the tube tool for this. I just think it's the easiest way to approach it, and you just have a lot of control of that shape. So that's what I'm doing, and I'm just messing with the radius, and I'm making the inner corners a lot smaller, and that way we have a nice taper going all the way across. And then I'll just mirror that and duplicate it to the other side as well. And then once again, this one's gonna have to be eyeballed because of my lack of brain when I decided to move the head off the center of the grid. And now moving on to the hands, and you guessed it, we will be using a sphere. Now, I will say this though, you don't have to use a sphere. You could technically use a cube. You could use a cylinder. I mean, you could literally use anything you wanted. I do honestly believe that sculpting is less about the process and more about the end results, because there are so many ways you could approach a sculpt. You know, there's not really necessarily a right or wrong way to do things in terms of, you know, what you're using to get to that end result. So just keep that in mind if you have a different way of doing hands, or literally how you would approach making this character. Don't feel like you're doing something wrong or anything like that. Again, there's so many ways to approach this, but to me, this is just kind of how I went about it. I used a little sphere for the palm of the hand, and I squished it and squashed it and tried to just kind of, you know, get that general placement of it. I'll mess with the wrist a little later, but for now, that's how I did it. And then I'm using the tube tool again to make my little fingers, and just, again, adjusting them, making them smaller, and placing them accordingly. And then once I get one finger down, typically I'll just duplicate that instead of trying to draw out every finger, because as you saw, it could be a little finicky when you're trying to draw the tube tool from like a perspective. And then I'm just making them nice and chubby, thinking about those bends and, you know, placement. I'm not going to do all 5 fingers for him because I don't think he has all 5 fingers in the picture. But it's just not necessary for the stylized character anyway, for a little dinosaur. And so here I'm duplicating that one. I'm just kind of moving it and rotating it to match the placement of the next finger. And what I love is that you still have control over each one of those points of that curve. Even after duplicating, you don't, you know, lose it. And that way, again, you have really full control of each one of your objects. once I'm happy with my hand, I'm going to adjust that arm to make more sense into as it's going inside of the hand and how that transitions over. And once again, just adjusting my shapes. That's really such a big part of this process, is just tweaking, adjusting, moving. And I'm using the move tool here, and I think the flatten tool maybe a little bit to just push the palm in a little bit, because, you know, even though this is not a realistic character, if you look at our palms, they're not necessarily bulbous, or, you know, they don't have that, like, that rounded sphere shape to it, but they kind of, I guess, cave in a little bit, especially at the palm where we typically hold and grab things. So I'm trying to kind of indicate that so that it looks more like a hand. Okay, and so now I want to actually duplicate this entire arm along with the hand into the other side. Even though I have the arm already on the other side, I decided that I don't want to try and eyeball, you know, the same thickness and shape of my hand, or my arm rather. So I'm just gonna send it all to the other side and adjust it accordingly. And here I am naming my layers, which you should definitely do. It's extremely important, because once you start to get further into the process and add more and more tool sets, you do not want to have 30 different spheres, 30 different tubes, and not know what corresponds to what. So please name your layers. Okay, so as you see here, while I was tweaking one of the arms, the other one was still mirroring, you know, what I was doing, and I don't necessarily want that anymore, because now I want to pose my arms independently. So what I do is I click on uninstance in my layer tool set, and what that's going to do is it's going to allow those arms to now move independently. And so now I'm just going to match my new mirrored arm to the position I had originally, and bring that hand down. And I haven't validated anything, which means I can still control those nodes to my liking, and that's very important to keep in mind. You don't want to validate too early, because then you're just kind of stuck with, you know, that shape, and you can't really control it all that great. So same thing with the fingers. I haven't merged the fingers to the palm yet, because I want to still be able to control each of those independently. And especially once I have my boxes positioned correctly, that way I know exactly how those fingers are going to land on the boxes, where they need to bend, and so on and so forth. So speaking of boxes, I'm bringing those back into my scene, or rather just unhiding them, so that I could position my arms accordingly. And right off the bat, I could see that my boxes are not matching that reference image, and you could just tell because, you know, first of all, they're so high up, they're almost covering our dinosaur's face, where in the image they're quite low, and we see a lot of his neck and his head. So I'm keeping that in mind, and I'm making adjustments. And of course, it's may not be an exact copy. Like, some of my boxes are going to be a little bit thinner or longer even than the ones in the picture, but you know, that's just going to be a decision that I make, which I'll be totally fine with. But yeah, so here I am trying to match that a little better, and, you know, adjusting my boxes to match that area where the arms, you know, between the chest and the arms, pretty much whatever area they have that they can fit. And if you need to make more adjustments, like making the arms a little longer probably, then this is where you do that. But if you had merged all of that, if you had already kind of married to that, it would have made things a little bit more difficult. So that's why I like to keep everything still in its basic form until I'm, you know, 100% sure that that's where that's going to stay. And again, name your layers. Name your layers. So once I'm happy with my arm placement, I am moving on to my footsies. And here I'm just going to duplicate that cylinder we had done earlier for our left foot and bringing it over to the right one. And just kind of, again, playing with the placement. And so in order to get that curve of the foot that's making contact with the floor, what I'm going to do is use the split tool to split kind of the toes from the rest of the foot, and then rotate that and just kind of push it up to where it would make sense and make sure it's still touching the rest of our foot. And later on I'll merge that to actually, you know, be one shape. But for now I'm just going to leave it like that because I'm not, you know, I'm still not 100% sure if that's going to work or if that's what I want. And then again, name your layers. Alright, and then for the roundness of our little foot, what I'm going to do is I am going to insert a sphere. And as usual, I'm just going to squash it and just kind of push and pull it to match that overall wideness of the foot. And again, right now it may all look a little bit rough, but once I merge everything and, you know, start to smooth, it'll all make a lot more sense. Alright, and then moving on, we are going to work on a little dragon scales. And for this, I'm going to be using a sphere. It comes in very handy, as you can see. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reduce that thickness and just kind of squish it in both sides. And using my move tool with a small radius, I'm going to pull out at the center of the sphere to just kind of get that taper, that point we need. Alright, and then I am going to follow that by just duplicating, scaling, rotating the other ones, and but you know, ultimately you can take your creative what? You can make your own creative decisions, yeah, that. And then in this case, I didn't want to scale it too much because I felt like it would be too small. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just trim the end using the trim tool. And that way it's just kind of a little bit of a hack, if you will. And yeah, again, just more tweaking. I'm sorry if you can hear my dog in the background chewing on his little toy and growling at it. Alright, and then with our scales done, my next goal is to merge the base of the foot with the sphere we created. So I'm going to use the voxel remesh at around 200 to just make those into one shape, and then I'm going to use my smooth tool to soften those edges where before they were, of course, two different shapes, and then just use my move tool to adjust our sphere some more accordingly, and just once again get the desired shape. And then I'm going to do the same exact thing to the other side. I'm just going to grab each of those pieces of geometry, and using the voxel remesh tool at around 200, I'm going to merge them. I'm also going to use the clay tool to kind of fill in that little gap that is going to exist because those two shapes were cut out and they were no longer one. And then use my smooth tool to just smoothen out all those rough edges. All right, and now for a very fun part, in my opinion, and that is making our little guy's pants. So the way I approach making clothes is typically by just using the mask tool. So I already have my, I guess, proportions, my shape for the legs. So that's going to just help us create those pants. And using our mask tool, I'm just going to paint exactly where those pants would be. So it's almost like I'm painting the pants on. And I'm going to paint, and I'm also going to erase to just clean up some of the edges and try and get really as close as possible to where I think those pants would lay on our character. And once I'm happy with that shape, I can go into the mask tools menu and I can adjust the thickness of that mask, and I can just hit extract. And what that's going to do is it's going to give me this beautiful pant that you see here. So it's going to extract out the mask outside of our existing mesh. And it's a really cool tool because you can use it to make things like this, like pants and clothes. And then I'm just going to play with, moving some of these things around and just making it a little bit more organic and make sure that it fits right with the rest of our shapes, like our foot. It's not intersecting with anything, or it's not looking funky. And in this case, I feel like the pant is a little bit too long, so I'm actually going to use the trim tool here to just cut some of the excess mesh out, and trying to be careful to not cut out on accident, the back of the pant or something like that. But that's a really cool tool to keep in mind and to use. And then again, I'm just going to use the smooth tool to soften some of these edges. I'm going back in to try and trim it some more, and this time I'm going to use the lasso tool so I could have more control of that cut. And one thing I also like to do is to use the flatten tool along the edges of my topology and just kind of go over it with that flatten tool. And I just feel like it gives it a much cleaner edge, and I don't know, it's just something I do. It's not necessarily necessary, but I do think some of these edges sometimes get a little bit wonky, and if you just use that flatten tool and even follow it with the smooth tool, you can get a really nice cleaner edge. Okay, and now I'm ready to merge our feet with the legs, and I'm just going to use the box over remesh tool again to bring those all into one mesh. And then with my smooth tool, I can just soften those edges that were left over. And for some of those areas that are still not cooperating a whole lot, I'm using the clay tool to build up a little bit and then smooth it out. I'm also just going to adjust the feet and the shape and how far they stick out. I'm just trying to match them, make sure they, look right and they look somewhat even. And to create our little toes, I'm just going to go in with the crease tool and draw on those little divisions for the toes. And that's pretty much it. I'm gonna kind of take it a little bit far on the bottom so that it just kind of sells the effect a little better. And follow that with the smooth tool as well to just clean up any rough edges, and do the same thing on the other side. Okay, and now moving up to our hands again, I'm going to join the fingers with the palm of the hand, and then I'm going to voxel rematch that. And that way I can go in and just soften everything up with the smooth tool, and then we get nice little hands. Now it looks a lot more like hands. And then I'm going to go ahead and join the arm with the hands and just do the same thing that we did with the fingers and the palm. Voxel remesh at approximately 200. And once it's joined and remeshed, I can just smooth it out. And again, it'll just all start to come together that way. Here I also like to use the crease tool to kind of refine that little line or wrinkle, bend, whatever you want to call it, between the wrist and the palm. Okay, so now that we have finished the arms, I'm sorry about my dog, we are going to move on to the shirt. And again, with clothes, I typically always use the same method, and that is using the mask tool to paint on where our shirt would be, and then extracting that out to give it the thickness. So that's what you see me doing here. Okay, so as you can see, I've extracted that mesh out to create a little shirt for our guy. And currently you see that I masked out the sleeves at the same time as I did the shirt. But I quickly realized that that is not the best way to go about it, because as you can see here, my sleeve is way too close to the torso. It's basically attached, and I don't have much room to play with it, or if I want to pull them down and have them kind of sag a little bit and look more organic, it just makes it a little bit harder, and you'll see it more on the other arm. As you can see, those two areas are just pretty much one mesh, and so I'm going to show you guys a better way to do this. So all I did was hit undo until I went all the way back to my mask, and I am just going to erase the areas where the sleeves are and just give them pretty much a little tank top. And this doesn't have to be perfect because we will be creating the sleeves, as you'll see next, and so it's okay if there's a little bit overlap or, you know, going into our arms. Okay, and then for the sleeves, what I did was I brought in a cylinder to use as a sleeve, and I'm just gonna position it approximately where that would go. And I find that this is just a smarter way to approach this, because again, then you'll have full control over the sleeves without affecting your t-shirt. Another cool thing is you can edit the radius separately of both of the ends of the cylinder, so you can have your sleeve taper out. Another good thing about this is that you can create a hole in your cylinder, because it does have that little setting in there, so then it'll just look more realistic as the arm will be coming out of it. And then ultimately, of course, we'll merge it back into the shirt, but I think this is just a much smarter way to approach making the sleeves. And I think it also is cool because it allows for us creating a little seam, or at least just kind of hinting at a seam once we do merge them together, because they will be two separate meshes. And again, once I'm happy with the positioning of my sleeves, I'm going to validate those cylinders so that I can use the sculpting tools to just, again, make it more organic. I want it to kind of sag a little bit and use gravity, good old gravity. And so yeah, again, this makes so much more sense. But this is really just what sculpting is. It's trial and error. And I almost look at it as a puzzle sometimes, where it's like, what is the best approach or the best way to build something? Because again, it's not all just default. Like, there's not a set rule book of how you should sculpt a shirt or how you should do XYZ. It really is just whatever works best for you. And now I'm going to just grab both my sleeves and my shirt and voxel remesh those at approximately 200 voxels. And then I'm just going to go in with my smooth tool and soften out those edges. I'm not too worried about the inside because it's not going to show. But you'll see that they're intersecting. Obviously, the little sleeves are inside the shirt, and you could, if you wanted to, trim those out. But I'm just not too worried about it, because it's not going to show. And then I'm using my flatten tool to go over those edges and get just a cleaner edge. And again, this is all just personal preference, but I just like to do that. And I'm also thinking about how the shirt is sitting on our character, and I'm trying to kind of have it be tucked into his pants. And so that's what you see me doing here. I'm just kind of adjusting and pushing those edges. So I guess if you think about it, me flattening out those edges was kind of pointless because we're not seeing them, but that's okay. It's part of the process. You live, you learn. So I've gone ahead and organized my layers, and I decided to add a collar, even though he does not have a collar in the reference, but I just find, I don't know, I like making little t-shirt collars, and I just feel like it'd be super cute. So that's what I'm doing. And again, just using the cylinder tool because it would just make the most sense. And I'm using the hole, or creating the hole. And of course, I'm going to rotate it and adjust it to match the angle of his neck. And just kind of tuck it into the shirt. And I do apologize about my voice. I feel like my voice has been cracking today. I don't know. I woke up with a sore throat, and just bear with me here. I'm sorry, I don't mean to sound like that, the teenager from The Simpsons. Alright, so once the adjustments are done, I'm happy with that. I'm going to just soften those edges of the collar. And then I'm going to voxel remesh it with our t-shirt, and that way it's all one mesh. And again, in this case, I didn't think about the fact that once I merged them, the shirt was going to kind of intersect with our hole and cover it, but it doesn't really matter because nobody knows and it's not going to show in our renders. So once again, I'm not too worried about it. And look at him, he looks so cute. He's starting to take shape. This video is so long and I'm so sorry. I hope that it's at the very least useful. Something I thought about after the fact was that we won't actually need the torso anymore, like the belly, because that's not going to show anything underneath the shirt. And that's a lot of extra topology that, again, is not necessary. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to split our arms out, making sure to leave enough room to where they'll still be inside of our shirt. And then I'm just going to delete that other extra mesh. And that's just going to clean up your scene. Obviously, this is not perfect, but it's going to serve its purpose because, again, this is really just for a render, you know, for a portfolio, just a look, a sculpt. It's obviously would not work this way if you were wanting to use this for, you know, rigging or animation, but once again, this serves the purpose that we need. It's also just good practice to try and keep your file as clean as possible, because not only is that going to affect your performance, but ultimately you don't want to have a scene that is an obnoxious amount of polygons or vertices in this case, because again, it's going to just hinder you. It's going to make the process a lot harder for you, because once you start to add color and lights in the scene and getting into the post-processing and rendering, it's really going to chug and it's going to become quite tough to work on a file if it's so heavy. So just keep an eye on your vertice counts. Nomad does show it in the interface up at the left corner, and I typically, it just depends on how complex my scene is, but I try my hardest to keep it under the millions. Obviously, that's not going to always be the case, and sometimes I just want it to look really clean, so I'm not really too worried about what the total count is at the end, if if it's at the place that I like it, and if that's just how I want my render to look. But again, in a more professional setting, or just for the sake of having, memory storage in your device, you don't want your file to be obnoxiously heavy. So just, again, keep that in mind. Now I'm starting to build his little suspenders, and I'm using the tube tool once again to do that. It's just going to be the easiest tool for this. I do have it, actually I don't have it set to mirror right now, but what I do have is I'm using a profile, which is, again, one of the little settings on the tool. That is going to make it have that more sharp, almost rectangular square profile instead of a round. And I love that you can also edit, the thickness of it and in the settings, and you could do a lot with it. You could have it taper, do all kinds of stuff. So I would definitely play with that setting, but I think this is a really cool update that Nomad did. And once I was happy with the first shape, I did go in and hit the mirror option to duplicate that. And I will, however, validate that mirror group and uninstance them so that I can control the other suspender freely, because of course it's going to be intersecting in some areas because the character is posed a certain way. And then I'm just gonna grab the little nodes and adjust that accordingly. And now I'm going to make the little buttons for the suspenders, and for this I'm going to use the cylinder, and I'm going to scale it accordingly, of course, and place it one on each of the ends of the straps. Okay, so I've gone ahead and placed my buttons, and as I was kind of looking at the shape of the pants, I felt like he definitely needed a thicker border or strap for the pants that kind of stands out. Like right now our pants are just kind of going into the body or like into the shirt, but we're not really seeing a really nice defined edge. And I figured in this case, because he's so oblong shaped, I don't know if that's the right word, but we've already kind of built the pants, I figured the best approach might be to go in with a curve tool, or I guess in this case I'm using the torus shape, which is just like a round helix. And similar to the tube tool, it does have the points that you can adjust accordingly. Actually, does it? Let me see. No, it does not have those, the little nodes. You can't control it unless you use the move tool. Then of course you can just move the shape accordingly. But because it doesn't have those nodes and I just wanted a more simpler and more control of this, I went in with the tube tool, and it has the action of closed, which will create a perfect helix, or just, it will just close the points. It won't create anything perfect. But I'm going to use that instead, and I'm just going to bring it down to the waist. Again, almost like we're making a little belt for him. And I'm going to change the profile setting to have that more rectangular shape instead of the round tube tool. And this would just be a whole lot of adjusting and just pushing and pulling to make sure that it hugs the pants and his little waist correctly, and just kind of get everything to match up. And hopefully this will give us a better look at the end. Okay, so I spent a lot of time adjusting that, and once I got it to where I'm happy with it, I'm going to join both of those and just voxel remesh them. And I'm going to go once again pretty high up in the 200s, and then with my smooth tool I will just go in and smooth that rough edge that's left over. But this looks a lot better. Like before, again, the pants were just kind of going into the shirt and there wasn't really any overlap or separation between the shirt and the pants. But I think this makes a lot more sense, and I think it looks so much cuter. Okay, so now that I've just done a whole lot of adjusting to my little straps and just make sure they sit on top of our pants properly now that we have made the band. Moving on to the head, and here I just smudged the snout with the skull, again using the voxel remesh, and now I'm smoothing over those rough edges again with my smooth tool. And we're gonna try and approach the little smile, which I think I'm just gonna use the crease tool to go in and see if we can match the picture. Okay, so after a lot of trial and error, I was really not liking the way the smile was coming out. using the crease tool, and so I decided that I was just gonna paint it on when I got to the painting and surfacing part. So I just kind of stopped, and now I'm moving on to something else. And sometimes that's what you gotta do. So here I'm actually realizing that our little tail is just kind of going through our pants, and there's not really, I don't know, I mean, it could do that, but I wanted it to look a little more, I guess, realistic, or I don't know, it's about the details. And so I thought we could just kind of cut out a little hole for the where the tail is. And to do this, I'm using the trim tool with the lasso selection to quite literally just cut out a hole, and then I'm just kind of adjusting it to better hug that tail. And I think that adds another level of just detail and thinking about some of these things where it would just look better, at least in my opinion, rather than it just being something that's like shoved through the pants, you know? Okay, and then here I'm just gonna be speeding through this because all I'm doing is really adjusting our boxes, and this I feel is less technical and just more of your artistic vision and whatever you feel would look best. Of course, mine is not, I try to match the reference as best as I could in terms of the sizes of the boxes, or at least their proportions rather, but ultimately, you know, it's not going to be exact, but I'm not too worried about it. And as you can see here, I'm moving his head up because I realized that the boxes were still covering his face, and I didn't or couldn't make the boxes smaller because I felt like that would look a little bit weird. So I just decided to push his neck up, but I did like the way that looked. So yeah, there's that. And now here we're gonna jump into making the little tape for the boxes, which I thought was really fun to do. And it really is just similar to how we approach the pants and the shirt, and it is by using a mask. And in this case, I'm using the selection mask tool, and you could not customize it, but you could choose for it to, instead of just be freehand painting on a mask, you could use the square selection tool, and then you can get a perfectly square or rectangular mask. And then here I'm just cleaning around those edges, and really I'm only getting those pixelated edges because I don't have enough topology in my mesh. But again, because this is just a square box, I don't necessarily want to make it obnoxiously, you know, subdivided. And then once I have my tape the way I like it or positioned accordingly, I'm going to adjust my thickness and I'm going to extract. Now, of course, I have the mask works, it goes through the object. So here I'm realizing that. So I'm just going to go back and unmask the back. And that way I don't have that issue. And then I'm going to just smooth out those edges, erase the mask from underneath, and then adjust the position of that tape to actually be, you know, sitting on the box. And I think it looks really cute. And I'm just going to do that for all the boxes. Alright, and I keep on thinking of other details to add. So in this case, I wanted to have that little seam going down the pants. So I approached that by using the crease tool and just kind of carving it out by hand. And as you can see, you probably want to turn symmetry off because the legs are not symmetrical at this point. And so that's going to give you wonky results. But again, I'm just gently going in with my crease tool and then softening it out. And I'm doing the same for both sides, just trying to match that reference image because he does have that brown little, like the seams going down the sides around the belt and little pockets as well, which I also add. Okay, and then I decided I wanted to add some detail to our buttons, so I almost forgot. So I am using the mask tool to just kind of create that inner area of the button that we're gonna then indent or push in. So once I've masked it out, I am going to use the invert tool. It's not really a tool, it's just if I tap the screen, it's gonna invert my mask. And then using the gizmo tool, I am just going to push that in like so. And I'm going to clear out my mask so that I can use the smooth tool to soften those rough edges. And then we have a nice little button shape. And to create those little holes in our buttons, I am just going to be using the trim selection tool, and I have the lasso selected, and I'm just drawing little circles for them. And I do have symmetry turned on so that I just makes it more efficient. And then I'm just going to soften those edges once I've cut them out, and that just gives us a really, really cute button. And then once I've created my first button, I'm just going to clone that and place it manually where my old buttons used to be, and just kind of replace those with the old ones. That way I don't have to create it, do them all from scratch. But okay guys, I think that is the last detail that I wanted to add on this little dinosaur. I am probably going to paint it off camera, and I'll be back for the final thoughts. Alright you guys, so this is our final dinosaur sculpt. I am so happy with the way he turned out. I think he is absolutely adorable, and I really hope that you guys picked up something today from my video. If you guys have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave them in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your feedback or any suggestions for future videos. But thank you guys so much for joining me today, and if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate a like. And if you'd like to see more videos like this in the future, don't forget to subscribe. But thank you guys so much, and have a great day.